same-sex marriage became the law of the land in 2015. It is one of the defining civil rights achievements of our era. But how did we get there? How did we go from being a society that barely acknowledged sexuality to one that legally, at least, has embraced same-sex marriage across the country? Our next guest is author of a new book that is the definitive history of that story. Sasha Issenberg is an accomplished political journalist and the author of The Engagement, America's Quarter-Century Struggle Over Same-Sex Marriage. He is also author of multiple best-selling books on politics and current trends. And I didn't know this until I got your bio, Sasha. He is currently teaching political science at UCLA. He is a personal friend from my reporting days in Washington, D.C., and a journalist for whom I have great admiration. I'm excited to end Sasha Issenberg. I am so excited to talk to you in general, but about this book, because I remember, Sasha, having a conversation with you when you just got your contract and you're setting out on this journey. I think it was in 2012, you reminded me. First of all, how do you feel?
It's been a long time coming, but when I started this, it wasn't clear there was an ending to the story. Part of what drew me to it, what seemed like it was ripe for a book treatment, was it felt like the country was reaching consensus on this issue. And I could sort of see that things were only going to head in one direction. But I didn't expect that there'd be a Supreme Court case, let alone a resolution at the Supreme Court. So one of the sort of surprising things is that the book actually has an ending. And when you take 10 years to write something, history has a way of providing you with that.
This was not an easy topic to tackle, I know. Why did you decide that this was a topic that you needed to gather history on and document?
Yeah, so the first sort of germ of curiosity, I've covered, as you know, I've covered politics for a while now, and during years when this was a major issue in our country, and it's not something I ever wrote about it in any real way, or not an issue I think I paid particularly close attention to. But when I was working on my last book about the science of political campaigns in 2011 and having a lot of conversations with pollsters or people who in some form or another measured attitudes, and over again, they would say a version of the same thing to me, which is that they never seen movement on a single issue as swift as they'd seen it move on marriage. And nobody had a really good explanation for that. And we were already starting to talk about this as the defining civil rights movement of my generation. And I just came to realize that I had no idea where this had come from, how it sort of entered our politics and came to dominate it in certain ways, and how we'd gotten from wherever there was to wherever here was. And it seemed like a sort of big topic that would help me understand to some degree, this country in the years that I'd lived through it.
Let me ask you to go in a little more depth on that, because I remember, even 10 years ago when gay marriage came up as a political issue, the sort of political class, the consensus was, this is not a smart issue to tackle. The politics aren't there yet to win on this, other issues to tackle first. But you talked about how the polling changed. Would you give us a sense of numbers over what time period, what was the magnitude of the shift, or on what specific questions did the public shift its opinion?
Yeah, so the first time the pollsters start regularly asking about gay marriage, which is like, do you think that gays and lesbians should be able to legally marry? Some version of that question. 1995, 96, Gallup is measuring 27% support for that. A week or two ago, Gallup came out with a number that 70% of the public supported, including a majority of Republicans now. And, basically with a few small interruptions, it's been basically an increase of 4 or 5 percentage points a year. By contrast, it's not like inevitable on a social cultural issue that people become more liberal. To take the obvious other example on abortion, public opinions in the almost 50 years since Roe v. Wade have been basically stable. So, one of the things that's notable, and it explains some of this change in and of itself, is just that young people have been more liberal on the question of, on a lot of LGBT rights questions, but specifically on marriage, just consistently in every cohort. So young Latinos are more liberal than older Latinos. Young evangelicals are more liberal than older evangelicals. That is not the case on abortion, for example, where, and under other sort of gender role related questions where there's not an obvious generational change.
And to what do the pollsters attribute that? That we all know someone who's gay, personal issue to us?
I mean, I think that is like as an organic driver of this. I think that there are things that campaigns did that changed the messaging around marriage in particular that we could talk about. That
I want to follow up on
moved opinions, but I think the central driver of this, the foundation of all of the sort of political and legal change, is social scientists call it contact theory, but you put it in better human terms, Jessica, which is like, somebody who's openly gay or lesbian, and that moves your political opinions. And we've seen now for decades that the best predictor of liberal attitudes, again, not just on marriage, but on a range of gay rights questions, is how somebody answers the question, do you have a friend, coworker, or family member who's openly gay or lesbian? And, that question, I think, first time I remember seeing was something like 1982, 83, it got asked, and it was, I think it was 20-something%, and now, people basically stopped asking it because it's close to 100.
So what did we get wrong in the early times? Was this embrace of gay marriage inevitable?
So no. So I mean, one thing that comes through in my story is I don't think any part of this was inevitable, and it certainly wasn't inevitable that this was going to come to the Supreme Court in 2015 and be successful there. I write about a strategy meeting that took place in Jersey City in 2005 of sort of key activist operatives, lawyers, about 10 people get together to come up with a national strategy with a bunch of donors with money behind it. So it's a real serious effort to come up with a national strategy to win marriage at the Supreme Court. And they lay out a deadline of 2025 as what they see as like an optimistic view of when you could take a successful case to the Supreme Court. And that's in 2005 already. So like already by then we're like, none of this is happening according to schedule. But the early part of my book, which starts in 1990, like just shows it's not inevitable that this was going to be the gay rights issue that we spent the 90s and 2000s fighting over. And some of that sort of accident, some of that serendipity. What I think people got wrong, one of the things people got wrong was, to the extent that there was a debate within the gay rights movement about strategy and priorities, there was an idea that marriage was going to be the toughest lift of all. It would be a lot easier to get Congress to pass a non-discrimination bill, for example. And there's now something called the Equality Act that is shows passed the House. Biden would sign it into law, but is nowhere near passing the Senate, it seems. The earlier version of that bill, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, was introduced in 1994. There's basically been no movement on this issue in
all that time,
27 years. And folks assume that because marriage would be the bigger, more transformative shift, it would be harder to attain. And I think in retrospect, there's something to be said for part of what makes marriage big as an issue is that it's widespread and familiar, but that probably also makes it accessible and easier to move public opinion on it. Like, no, it's hard to find anybody in America who's more than 1 degree of separation away from a marriage. And so I think it's like tactile, it's immediate. Sorry?
Traditional. It's embraced.
Yeah, and it's fundamentally conservative, right? And so, this was, I think, the other part of it that on one level, it's radical to say, here's this institution which has existed the way it has all over the world for thousands of years. There's never been a society on earth which has legally recognized marriage as anything other than a man and a woman. Like, absolutely, and disrupting that is a dramatic shift in a traditional institution. On the other hand, there's something fundamentally conservative about it. And one thing that I think is really notable is that, unlike other civil rights demands, it does not ask anything of the majority or the people who are in power to give up.
Oh.
And, there's not a sort of like, one way to look at some of the other civil rights movements is that whether it was desegregation of schools or people who were attached to their neighborhood schools that were going to change. When women got the vote, it diluted the political power of men. like when gays and lesbians were able to marry, if there had been a limited number of marriage licenses in our state of California, and straight people knew that if they supported gay marriage, they might have to wait 9 months in line at the clerk to get a marriage license, I think there would have been a very different dynamic about the sense of competition. And so I think one of the things, it turned out to be really easy.
Interesting.
In an unexpected way.
I want to come back to that. Let's do a little bit of the history, and we can't do all the twists. But you write about the original event in Hawaii in 1990 that, in your view, sort of catalyzed the fight for legal. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so this is the sort of inadvertent origins of this thing that shows how not inevitable this was. I write about a local activist named Bill Woods, who, like a lot of first generation activists, I think in any community, was very entrepreneurial, very good at getting attention. He created a whole lot of things. Created the Gay Community Center, the gay newspaper, the first gay radio show in Hawaii. He was the gay activist in Honolulu in the 70s and 80s. He was not particularly good at building alliances or working well with other people. And he ends up in this very petty fight within a pride planning committee in 1989. He has a rivalry with these two women who are sort of in charge of the committee because they've launched a magazine that is competing with his gay community news for the small pool of advertisers who want to be in LGBT publications. And he wants to have a parade, and they just want to have a picnic as part of this fairly small pride celebration in Honolulu. And so, this is like anybody who's been on an event planning committee will get PTSD from this part of the book. But, he wants to do the parade, so they tell him he can have a subcommittee to explore the parade. He comes back with a report. They don't want anything to do with this, but so they ignore it. He decides he's going to start his own pride parade and rally council to put on his own parade that's going to compete with their events. And now he's looking for any possible way to upstage their pride celebration. And so he invites the governor to be the grand marshal of his parade. He gets a friend who's a caterer to set up an international food festival. He gets a Royal Hawaiian Jazz Band to perform. And he decides there's going to be this mass wedding. It's kind of like Mooney style, several dozen couples getting married on stage at a rally at the end of his parade. And he is not a lawyer. He clearly misreads state law on this, and he thinks that it's entirely possible to likely that if these couples exchange vows, that the state will have to recognize them as married. And so he goes to the ACLU to represent him or to sort of back him up. They want nothing to do with him. And they keep on pushing him off and hoping that he'll just sort of lose attention and move on to something else. And he doesn't. And in December 17th, 1990, he sort of organizes this PR stunt with the goal of forcing the hand of the ACLU that the public pressure will just make them have to get in line. And so he brings these three couples into the public health department to request marriage licenses, and they are rejected. And the attorney general says that the health director was right not to let them marry. And they end up in the hands of a local civil rights attorney who sues the state of Hawaii. And to the shock of everybody involved in this, in May 1993, the Hawaii Supreme Court becomes the first court on earth to rule that the fundamental right of marriage extends to same-sex couples.
That is a great story, very well told.
Thank you.
So you referenced the fact that plenty of people in the LGBTQ movement did not originally think that gay marriage should be the single issue. Workplace discrimination, housing discrimination could have been their issues. But ironically, the opposition in some ways to gay marriage that sort of catalyzed this or pushed this to the front as the next big fight. Would you explain who were the opponents and what was the unintended effect of their opposition?
Yeah, so the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints becomes the first institution on the mainland to really appreciate the gravity of this Supreme Court decision in Hawaii. And so the Mormon Church has had a historic presence in Hawaii dating back to missionary work that they did in the Pacific. They're a big landowner there, so they're fairly plugged into Hawaii politics. And they and it had a sort of history of being against gay rights in any number of spheres. And so they set off on a few projects in 1994. One, they helped pass a law in Utah that says Utah's not going to recognize any gay marriages that come out of Hawaii. Two, they set up they try to get involved in this lawsuit in Hawaii when it's on appeal, and they set up a front group working with the Archdiocese of Honolulu to try to get the legislature to pass a constitutional amendment that will take this out of the hands of the courts. And then what they end up doing is starting to raise interest on the mainland among other players, and eventually evangelical activists and some Catholics take an interest in this. And it takes a while for people to really recognize that how close Hawaii is to legally marrying same-sex couples. And this interest among evangelicals reaches Congress in early 1996. Republicans in Congress introduced the Defense of Marriage Act, which is this effort to effectively insulate governments on the mainland from the prospect that one trial court judge in Hawaii is away from ruling that same-sex couples can marry immediately. And so Defense of Marriage Act does two things. It tells the other 49 states you are free not to recognize these marriages, and more importantly, the federal government will not recognize anything that other than a man and a woman is married. And so this sails through Congress in the summer of 1996. It passes overwhelmingly. It's incredibly contentious, and then gets signed into law by Bill Clinton in the fall of '96. And what has happened during this period is, as you say, there'd been the gay, not just the gay rights movement, the gay and lesbian community broadly. To the extent anybody was paying attention to this, to marriage, it was a very abstract discussion before the Hawaii case. And people were split not only on the strategic question, should we go for these other incremental goals, maybe like domestic partner recognition, stuff like that, versus like this big ask, but there's also an ideological division. There were folks who sort of came out of the liberationist part of the gay and lesbian movement that thought, why would we aspire to this like mainstream middle class, the sort of like white picket fence ideals of our 50s parents? Gays and lesbians have sort of developed sexual values and mores that are separate from mainstream heterosexual culture. Why would we want to be married? Why would we fight for this? And those are like active, abstract philosophical debates in the 80s. They split men and women in certain ways. There's sort of feminist lesbian movement that sort of accepts a feminist critique of marriage as this like institution that was developed to subjugate women. Why would lesbians want to fight for the right to be part of this institution? Once basically religious conservatives on the mainland decide that this is going to be the number one area on which they fight gays and lesbians in the 90s, those divisions go away. And all of a sudden, I quote Paula Edelbrook, who's one of the leading feminist critics of marriage within the gay community. And she says, about 1995, 96, like the whole world is in flames about our relationships. Our opponents are trying to deny us this thing. Obviously, I'm going to be fighting for it. And just in terms of unintended consequences, nothing unified. The gay rights movement would have remained totally fractured about this question if their opponents hadn't decided to make this the place where they picked a fight.
Interesting. People will have to read the book to get a lot more of the next steps, the details that happen next, and you document it beautifully. I want to flash forward to 2012. Let's talk about the Democratic Party. You mentioned the Defense of Marriage Act. Bill Clinton signed that into law in, I think, 1996. And in 2012, Joe Biden came out in favor of gay. Barack Obama followed shortly after. We'll talk about that. What was the debate inside the Democratic Party during the time, and what was the reluctance to embrace gay marriage about?
So I think part of it was, I think the reluctance was basically politicians are risk averse, and this was broadly unpopular everywhere except for the most liberal pockets of the country. And certainly there was a real fear in 2004 when George W. Bush and other Republicans were actively jumping on this issue, that it was the type of wedge issue that would divide Democrats and not have any obvious political upside. I think that changed a little after gay couples could start to actually legally marry in Massachusetts. It wasn't just abstract anymore. But what also changed during that period was this had been a two-sided issue in 1996. You either thought gays and lesbians should have the right to marry, or you thought they shouldn't. What happens in 2000 is Vermont creates this new institution called civil unions. The Vermont Supreme Court faces a lawsuit not unlike the one in Hawaii. They end up ruling in a more complicated way. They say under the Vermont Constitution, the state cannot deny the equal benefits of marriage to same-sex couples, but tells the legislature you don't actually have to let gay couples marry. And so the Vermont legislature creates what they call civil unions. First time that term has been used, and it becomes basically all of the legal rights and benefits of marriage under a name that presumably will not invoke religious or sort of traditionalist opposition in the same way. And that then becomes the safe position for national Democrats for a decade. And so, what you hear from John Kerry and Joe Biden and Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and any other Democrat of any significance over the course of that decade is some version of, I think marriage is between a man and a woman, but I think the gay and lesbian couple should be entitled to all of the same rights and benefits that everybody else is under the law. And that ends up becoming the sort of, that's the Democratic platform position. That is, and it becomes, some Democrats get kind of dug in on the distinction between civil unions and marriage. One of the things that starts to happen by 2011 is, first of all, public opinion has just kept on moving towards marriage. So by the time Biden makes that statement, 51%, I think, of the country supported gay marriage rights. And this is really a story, a great example throughout of an issue where politicians have been followers of public opinion rather than leaders of it.
I want to follow on that, but just briefly and not take a lot of our time on it. Because we both covered the White House at this time in politics. We recall that at that time, Joe Biden came out for gay marriage on Meet the Press. The White House scrambled quickly to have Barack Obama follow and say that is his position. But until then, he'd been saying his position was evolving, and there's been this debate. It's an inside debate about whether Obama would have gotten there as quickly without Biden going first. Do you think, or have you nailed down whether Obama was going to come out for gay marriage this early before the general election in 2012, had Biden said nothing?
Yeah, the working plan was he would do it basically a month later. And so this had been since the prior summer, New York legalized same-sex marriage, and Obama basically is effectively jealous of the attention that Andrew Cuomo gets as this kind of liberal hero, and Obama feels out of sync with the kind of activist base of the Democratic Party on a civil rights issue. And his administration, his White House has wrestled with this on legal terms. Should they defend the Defense of Marriage Act in courts and stuff like that? But it's in the summer of 2011 that he goes to his team and says, look, I'm ready to make this change, but you guys have to figure out how I do this politically. It's like one thing if you're a county executive or something and you change your view on something nobody really notices. There was an understanding he had to come out and make an announcement and explain it. And so they went through a bunch of different there's a question of the timing. How do they do this before the re-election, but do it in a way that it doesn't take over the election campaign? They did not want to spend the debates with Mitt Romney talking about this. And the plan was that he would go on The View. There had been a bunch of research that suggested that it is better. They didn't want him to give a big speech like he did on race in 2008. They thought it would draw too much attention. So they wanted to have an interview, and there was research that suggested that a female interview would be better. I don't know if there's research that suggests that 4 female interviewers are better than 1, but the plan was that he would be in New York anyway to do fundraisers, and I think in the month of June he would go on The View and do it. And when basically Biden was aware of the general contours of this plan, not necessarily the specifics. And what Biden's statement did was basically accelerated this by a month, and obviously made Obama look like he was being reactive instead of sort of
got a little over his ski.
Yes.
So this is something I've thought a lot about because what can other civil rights movements learn from the strategic success of gay marriage? And one thing that's always struck me is that they chose a very traditional topic. They chose a traditional issue that, as you say, it might have seemed to be, the third rail at first, but it has such broad support, or it's so familiar to so many people. And in a way, one gay rights activist said to me, at a certain point, we were known as AIDS activists. Everything about the gay and lesbian movement was about sex and death. And we wanted to get away from that topic. And what more profound shift than to focus on unions and love? Is there anything that other movements can learn from their choices here that could help the women's movement make progress, or BLM have more cross-cultural appeal?
So one thing you see is that there are efforts to replicate what we were talking about earlier, which is the power of somebody knowing somebody, in this case, who's openly gay, or through campaigns. And so, I write a bit about how, especially in the lead up to 2012, gay marriage campaigners tried to build into their campaigns through what they were doing in advertising, and more importantly, what they were doing in canvassing and in phone calls to try to effectively replicate or package some of the power of knowing somebody in your real life who's openly gay or lesbian to a stranger. And so, some people call this deep canvassing. There are a lot of different terms for it among political professionals. But, I write about, there was a constitutional amendment that was on the ballot in Minnesota, and they ran their phone banks where they would, instead of encouraging their callers to get through this script, read the script verbatim in 45 seconds and get through it so you can get to the next one, they would encourage these people to call, strangers, obviously, and open up a free-flowing conversation about to get to what does marriage mean to you, with the idea of basically convey, trying to get to a point where people, generally people who were sympathetic to civil unions but opposed to gay marriage, would come to the conclusion that gays and lesbians want to marry for the same reason that straight people want to marry: love, commitment. I couldn't imagine my life without somebody, that type of stuff. And the way to get there was to open up this really intimate conversation where sometimes the callers were gay or lesbian themselves, sometimes they were straight people who had family members, sometimes they were just sort of ally types. But to say, what does marriage mean to you, to Edna in Duluth or something, that's a crazy thing for campaigns to do, to relinquish that much control around a really sensitive topic. And we've seen efforts to try to experiment with this with trans folks, can you have people who are victims of gun violence talk about that to strangers? Can you personalize your communications as a campaign so that you get some of the power of strangers feeling a personal familiarity with people and getting past the kind of the natural distance that comes along with a lot of especially identity-based political issues.
So interesting. And to everyone watching, that is the kind of detail that makes Sasha such a good journalist. Would you talk about who in the LGBTQ movement was left out of the fight for gay marriage?
Yeah, so, one thing so in a very simple way, this is an issue that served the interests of gays and lesbians. The fact is that for decades, transgender people and bisexuals have often been able to marry the person that they loved, even when same-sex marriage was illegal in their states. So just a sort of basic fact of biology there. And so there wasn't necessarily the same interest in this issue among, bisexual and transgender parts of the community. But I think in legal terms, the Supreme Court decision in 2015 that Anthony Kennedy wrote this, what was a very moving piece of writing in Obergefell for a court decision. But he wrote it as a marriage case. He did not write it as a civil rights case. And that meant, as a matter of the legal rationale for it, has not been, there was a way that case could have been decided. Ruth Bader Ginsburg said this is basically how she would have written the majority opinion if it had been in her hands, would have been to write it as something that set a new standard for treating sexual minorities the same way that that race and religion and sex are treated under civil rights laws. And if that had been the case, you would have ended up to the same place on the marriage law question, but you also might have had a lot of other laws struck down or prevented that permit discrimination against not just gays and lesbians, but transgender folks, bisexual folks, all sorts of other sexual minorities. And that's not how Anthony Kennedy wrote his decision. And so you get this sort of amazing moment, I guess 6 years ago this week, where you have a piece of legal writing that's you still see merchandise all over the place. Go on Etsy, you'll see more stuff with quotes from Obergefell than you'd ever expect from a piece of legal writing. And I think it was emotionally very powerful, but its legal reach was limited. And to some extent, we're fighting the exact same fights as a country over, gender identity issues that we would have fought beforehand. And this movement was incredibly successful in getting straight folks, including like just normal people, to recognize that gays and lesbians want to get married for the same reason. You know, I think you can make the case that the gays and lesbians have done more to make the institution of marriage stronger than anyone else in America over the last 30 years, in part because they have forced, in an era where divorce rates are very high, where people are getting married later and later. Effectively, this political demand forced a national conversation about what marriage means, and courts have done more to say that marriage is this exalted status that no other familial relationship, there are all sorts of rights and benefits you can't get. But what it did was it really became about marriage and not necessarily about the rights of sexual minorities more broadly.
Let me follow on that briefly, if we could, because it reminds me sort of the opposition that's come up to trans rights, the focus on bathrooms and language, gendered language, the opposition to that. It reminds me of what you described as this early opposition to gay marriage sort of forcing the movement to coalesce around an issue. Do you see something similar happening now, where this aggressive push against expanded gender rights might push progressives to embrace those issues even more broadly than to at this point?
Yeah, I think part of it is our parties are more polarized. So where Bill Clinton was worried about being, but Bill Clinton in 1996, Barack Obama in 2008 were worried about being too far left within their own parties, worried about alienating conservative Democrats or moderate Republicans that they could win over by being too far left on gay issues. Joe Biden sees he's saying stuff and committing to policy, positions on trans issues that you couldn't have imagined a Democrat doing before. In part because I don't think he sees that there's a risk of being too far to the left of his party on this, because the party is so unified. And so what you do see is Joe Manchin's an outlier in every possible way, including on the Equality Act. But by and large, the Democratic Party is as central to the modern Democratic Party, as certainly more central now on trans rights than on gay marriage until very recently. And the flip side of that, though, is that it makes it a lot harder to peel off Republicans, I think, because that's like the nature of polarization. And so I suspect that, on a lot of issues, it's actually very easy to get to 50% in this environment, but breaking past 50% gets really difficult, because once it gets sort of set in a political, in a partisan dynamic, it's hard to break that down.
Here's an audience question. When that you're coming on, I ask people, what are their questions? How crucial or important was Gavin Newsom's embrace of gay marriage early on?
I think it did, did a few things. One, so this is in February 2004. A few months before Massachusetts will start to legally marry couples, Newsom, as mayor of San Francisco, says, I am, in clear defiance of existing law in California, going to start just marrying couples at City Hall. And he's able to keep on doing this for almost 2 weeks before a court order stops him. I think he did a few things. One, he was, the first major, he was now he's a much bigger political figure than he is now. He was a newly elected mayor of a not terribly large city, so he wasn't a huge national figure. But it was somebody who was in, one ACLU attorney who was involved in these fights told me they were initially the whole gay rights movement was basically opposed to this. They thought it was reckless. They thought it was going to embolden opposition. They knew that these marriages would not be able to stand. There was some expectation that he was raising, some says he was raising expectations or was going to ultimately hurt people who went and got married thinking that they actually had legal marriages, and then we're going to find out that they didn't mean anything, that's just
not cool.
Not cool, sociopathic, your choice of words. But an ACLU lawyer, Matt Coles, sort of told me, and he wasn't the only one. There were some county officials around the country who during this period said, we're going to do this of our own accord. And that for the first time in the lawsuits that followed, you had the executive of a government saying, I want to do this. All the other previous cases had been basically couples suing the government for the right to do this. And now you had the government going into court and saying, we want to do this. And that was a different posture towards that the judiciary saw, where you had one branch of government that was invested in this outcome. And one thing that becomes really important in the case that brings marriage to California in 2008, and then when Prop 8 passes and is challenged in court and ultimately goes to the Supreme Court, the city of San Francisco is litigating this on behalf of gays and lesbians in their city. And that is very different than just having a civil rights organization send up a lawyer to represent them.
So it mattered. It mattered.
It mattered, yeah, in an indirect way. It mattered, definitely.
I could keep going. There's so many sort of challenges to what gay couples can do, and there's tons of issues. But I think I want to end on this question, which is a special request. Same-sex marriage is often used as an example of a political science theory called the Overton Window. Did I say that right? The Overton Window. You are a political science professor. That must be a killer class. As I understand it, the Overton Window's basically about what is possible in our politics at a given time. But would you explain this concept and what gay marriage, the success of gay marriage teaches us about this?
Yeah. So visualize a window, and the window is what political positions are basically broadly acceptable within mainstream thinking at the time, and that determines the range of policy outcomes that can be enacted. So, legalizing cannabis is like within the Overton window now. It wasn't like 20 or 30 years ago. It was just like not really a policy option. Like legalizing cannibalism is like still outside the Overton window, right? And marriage was, I mean, absolutely was just, you go back to before this case in Hawaii, there wasn't a gay rights organization in the United States that had endorsed marriage. There was barely a politician in the country that had been asked his or her opinion on it. And by introducing it, I think definitely expanded the conversation we are having about sort of gay rights and what sets of political opportunities are available to gays and lesbians. The flip side is the version of the conversation we just had about the Equality Act, which is we sort of expanded the window, but there are still a lot of things that you thought would have been doable in that window where there's been very little to no progress in a long period of time. And so, I think that is, to the extent that there's people who sort of rue this as a missed opportunity, there's some sense that it was this huge gain, a huge civil rights breakthrough, landmark Supreme Court decision, not to minimize any of that, but you haven't necessarily seen a whole bunch of other changes come along with it.
Not yet, maybe.
Not yet.
Sasha, you do such a beautiful job of documenting this history. It is it's the definitive work on this topic, and I hope you're having a blast. You got the cover of the New York Times book review, which is amazing. So are you getting a little bit of rest, or are you doing this nonstop?
I'm doing a bit of this, but I guess the good part about COVID is I'm doing it all from my home. So I at least I sleep in my own bed every night.
I'm glad. Well, I want to tell people to buy The Engagement. It's a gorgeous book, and I hope you have.
And I'll say one other thing on that note while we're hawking things. Folks, buy the book wherever you like to buy books. But if you go on my website, which is sashaissenberg.com, and fill out a form and send me your receipt, I will send you a personally inscribed book plate that you can put in your book, so it basically becomes a signed book in the absence of in-person book signings. That's what we're doing. So sashaissenberg.com, my first name, last name.com.
We'll put it in the caption so people can find it. Sasha, thank you so much. I hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Jessica. This was great.